wide receivers. And Travis, this is one of your babies in an area that you've done a lot of fantastic research. And I think the area that people are kind of the most excited about when we get to talking about rookie drafts, because even though running backs are still sort of the crown jewel, if you have a guy who's a star, we know these wide receivers, if you hit, not only do you have a guy who's going to make an impact now, but you have a guy who's going to make an impact for a decade, where the running backs can have a hard time holding up to that level. We hear a lot that the 2022 draft isn't very strong, that if you have a chance, you should trade out into 2023, which has all kinds of problems because we don't know what's going to happen between now and then. You lose all of that time value for your picks, and perhaps you pass on some guys that are extremely exciting. One of the things that really jumps out kind of at the top of this draft is that there are some wide receivers who are very intriguing. It seems like one of the reasons that perhaps people aren't looking at these guys in the same light as some other players is that, well, number one, and we don't have a Jamar Chase, but that's going to be true basically every year, right? I mean, he's someone who comes along, once every 15 years. And you kind of have to look back to Calvin Johnson to see someone that you could be that excited about. But the other thing is that we have guys who are coming out early, which we know is great, but when they're coming out early and had a season, for most of them, obviously that sophomore campaign that was so odd, we maybe have a little bit less to judge these guys on, but that doesn't mean that we don't have some real stars. Take us through some of the highlights of the adjusted production index. You're looking at peak dominator rating. You're looking at peak yards per team attempt. You're looking at peak touchdown per team attempt, and kind of going through and putting these guys in their percentiles where they fit, kind of looking back to other types of players. But one of the other things that I just really love about what you did for the rookie guide is that you do break down the different elements. So if someone, wants to see the yards per team attempt, the peak numbers for that, they can do that. If they kind of want to see, how they fit in the three categories, where they're strong, where they're weak. If you have someone like a Drake London, for example, who the area that maybe he didn't pop was touchdowns, and you're thinking that's kind of odd because, he's obviously someone who projects as a good touchdown score at the NFL level. Maybe you even boost his profile a little bit more. So you're like, yeah, I'm not worried about that. Start us off here. Treylon Burks, just how good of a prospect is he?
Well, in this class, he should be considered the top analytical candidate. He, peaked at like 47% in terms of his dominator, taking up about half of the receiving production in his peak year for Arkansas, which is just fantastic. And then again, his yards per team pass attempt, which is the easiest metric, I think, to understand, because it's exactly what it sounds like. It is that his receiving yards per his team's pass attempts, and so it's 3.8 there, which a really good NFL wide receiver might eclipse 3 yards per team pass attempt. He's almost up to 4. And so he was crazy high in that measure. And again, even with the touchdowns, like scoring an insane amount of touchdowns per team pass attempt too. So really just fills out his profile from every single angle and really comes in around the 94th percentile among drafted wide receivers. And so Burks doesn't have very many questions because he's got the speed, he's got incredible size, he's got a great analytical profile. Why he's weird is because he basically plays like a big slot wide receiver most of the time. So he almost projects like a modern move tight end more than he does a wide receiver, given his size and speed and his usage. But I think in the NFL, he's going to be a wide receiver. He's going to be that guy who can play X, but he can absolutely destroy slot defenders given his size speed combo. And so I think he's going to be just this unicorn potentially that maybe helps define what team big wide receiver can look like in the future, because we've seen this shift away from that. I think guys like Burks could bring that back if he's used in the right scheme, because I think he's going to hit wherever he goes. In this class, like there's nobody that touches his analytical profile or his physical stature and speed combo. So he's really fun.
Yeah, there's a lot of, over the last probably 5 or so years, there's kind of more different body types at the wide receiver position around the NFL than we would have had in the previous maybe 20 years. But there's going to be some interesting candidates, like you mentioned there, to see if we can get that mold of team big wide receiver back on track. Drake London looks very good in this draft class, but given his size, what are we looking at here with touchdowns hopefully not being an issue when it comes to the NFL level? Do you think he is somebody who may be undervalued in this class?
I think so right now, just because I think what's going to end up happening is he's going to be a top 15 overall NFL draft pick And then any doubt as to how the NFL values him is going to be left behind. And so we haven't seen this many big wide receivers drafted early in recent classes, but we've got Treylon Burks, huge dude. Drake London, huge dude. And we got George Pickens, again, like 6'4 plus and 200 pounds and fast. And these big wide receivers are going to be fun. And the thing about London, like with his touchdowns, so I mean, USC just kind of spreads the ball around. Like we haven't schematically, we've seen them like go a bunch of 10 personnel with like 4 wide. At worst, they're in 11 personnel, and it's like nothing but pistol and shotgun at all. Like even if they need 1 yard, it's 4th and half a yard, they'll line up in the pistol. They don't care. It's been really weird the past few seasons, which has kind of hindered the peak profile of guys like Amon-Ra St. Brown and Drake London because of just how they utilize and spread around, utilize a wide variety of schemes and wide receivers. And they've had some good ones that have played together, and they've kind of sapped each other's production. But Drake London's, I guess, 8 or 9 game stretch last year where he had 120 targets or so, we really missed out when he went down with an injury to his ankle. We missed out on one of perhaps what could have been like one of the best receiver seasons ever. So he was really fixing his production profile before he went down. So, about half of the team's receiving production, really showing some efficiency, just not putting up a bunch of touchdowns because they had, an injured Keaton Slovis, and then they had a true freshman in Jackson Dart. So the efficiency wasn't going to be there. They weren't scoring a bunch. The program let go to their head coach. USC kind of fell apart. And so that didn't help. But London is a fantastic player. His usage is a little bit odd just because it's a bunch of goes, comebacks, curls, and screens. And so he needs to round out the diversity of his route tree, I guess, if we want to nitpick. But he's a first-round wide receiver for sure.
And you mentioned a top 15 pick for him, someone who could go in the top 10 and has a little bit of a different profile and is not that kind of size specimen, but people have been thinking would be the top receiver in this draft for a long time. We look at Garrett Wilson, right? He has got good numbers in dominator rating, good numbers in yards per team pass attempt. And that's especially when you consider the teammate competition. And we were talking about a borderline Alabama situation here where they had the 4 first-round wide receivers. Travis, tell us a little bit about what you still might be looking for from him in the process. And would you consider him to be a possibility at the 101 if he goes as the first wide receiver in the reality draft?
Oh, man. Yeah, I guess you would have to have him in that conversation. I think it's funny, as much as I talked up Treylon Burks, Garrett Wilson's actually still my wide receiver 1 because he actually, I think I don't have questions about his deployment in the pros. Like we've seen his particular archetype succeed within the most recent modern version of the NFL game. And Wilson succeeded in every role that he's been asked to play in, whether it was when he was a freshman in more of a slot role, whether it was after they moved him outside and he succeeded there. He succeeded as a deep receiver. He succeeded as a possession receiver, and he checks all the analytical boxes as well. And the thing about the adjusted production index, like it's not like a 1-to-1 ranking system. Hey, you're the highest there, and so you're automatically my wide receiver 1. Like, I just want to see a guy get at least the 60th percentile. Like over the years, when I break down the numbers in both projecting capital and projecting future success, you really need, like there are exceptions, but you really need to be above the 60th percentile. And if you're above the 60th percentile and you're a fantastic wide receiver, especially if you're sharing targets with a bunch of other fantastic wide receivers, I don't have like almost any questions. I think back to the year that we saw, AJ Brown come out. Like he didn't have a crazy peak profile, like by the adjusted production index's standards. Like he was in the 60s in terms of his percentile, but he was splitting targets with DK Metcalf. So like you're not going to have half of the entire team's offense when you have another premier NFL wide receiver garnering targets. It's just not going to happen. And Wilson had 2 of those. Like Chris Olave also might get first-round capital. Jackson Smith and Jigba, better than both of them, and is going to be the wide receiver 1 and wide receiver 2 next year. Like Wilson and Olave themselves have said JSN's better than them, like, which is crazy because Wilson could be the wide receiver 1 this year. I just don't have virtually any questions because from a film standpoint, he runs every route you want him to, and wins in every way that you want him to. He can play bigger than he is as well, given his freak athleticism. And we've seen that dating back to his high school days when he was a 5-star recruit. And I mean, it's been since early high school. We knew, yeah, this kid's going to coach to the pros.
How fast is he?
I think he's going to be 4.2, 4.2s, 4.42, 4.45, that kind of range. And I don't really care if he runs a 4.46. I'm not going to be like, oh my gosh, he's so slow, because like he plays fast enough and separates consistently like every play.
I asked this as well when we talked about the quarterbacks, and it's a question that I know listeners love to hear. I know it's the thing that people like to click on when they see about sleepers online and things like that as well. We want to dive in. We want to know who is kind of the player we can get at the lowest cost that's going to be the biggest superstar. But are there some guys that this year are again going to slide maybe a little bit under the radar and can provide that value? And I guess sometimes when we talk about that, it can even be a guy who's going in the second round who is, we're still buying at a good value, even though he's going at that spot. Is there anyone that you're really keen on heading into this draft?
I think my favorite pick for that would be David Bell of Purdue. And that's not just because I went to Purdue, but I think he's going to slip because he's not going to have this NFL combine performance that has people drooling. He's going to be fast enough. He's going to be big enough. And there were already questions, I think, about his peak athleticism or whatever. But we're talking about a guy who's been one of the most productive wide receivers in the nation since he joined the college ranks. But even prior to that, he was like setting records in my home state of Indiana for being one of the most productive, prolific wide receivers ever. And then decided to stay home and go to Purdue. He could have gone to so many other places and just maybe even smashed even more. And, maybe if you put an Alabama A on his helmet, he's a surefire first-round pick. But I think just because we saw Rondale Moore, have the freshman NFL season that he did last year, which I guess disappointed many people in terms of
broke our hearts.
Yeah, exactly. I think, well, here's another Purdue guy. He's probably just going to do the same thing, but he's a completely different player. He's an outside X wide receiver that, accounted for almost 50% of Purdue's production in his peak year. And yes, he didn't have the crazy peak adjusted yards per team pass attempt, but that's because the Purdue offense is just inefficient and they have constant undrafted free agent talents all around them that hurts the efficiency there. So I think Bell is going to go in the second round of the NFL draft and is going to be the forgotten wide receiver. And even though like we all ranked him highly in Devy circles for years because he's amazing. And so, but he's not there. I think a lot of people have him like outside their top 7 or 8 even wide receivers in this class. And I think that's a mistake.
So you're not worried that he is going to really plummet in the reality draft and just
No, I think he's going to be, he's probably going to go in around pick 60-ish, near the end of round 2, maybe even early round 3 and something like that. And that might sound like a super disappointment, but I think he's good enough to earn a role wherever he goes pretty early on in his NFL career. And I think that only makes him cheaper. And that's fantastic because he's a great player.
Did you enjoy that clip? Make sure you hit that subscribe button to get more content from RotoViz. And of course, you can check out full-length podcasts at rotoviz.com/podcast. Available on all podcast platforms. Check out our wide range of content. Once again, rotoviz.com/podcast.